Francois Villon. Novel by Iva Kenaz. Read by Thomas Lichtag. Part 1. Regnier de Montigny.
Chapter 1. Disgrace. Paris, May 1451. How little did we appreciate our school years at the Sorbonne. While we lived them, we wanted nothing more than to break free, but once we found ourselves out in the wider world, we longed to return to the university's safe nest. We were the lucky ones who were allowed to study as opposed to laboring in the shadows of our beloved Paris. Not that those days were easy, they were difficult, even tragic at times, but I decided to hold on to the cheerful memories. Student pranks were our biggest passion, mainly because it made us laugh and the city guards sweat. Our greatest achievements were immortalized by none other than the art student Francois Montcourbet, alias Villon, a man who was as earnestly loved as he was hated. This was due to his crude sense of humor and sharp tongue, which mercilessly delivered whatever entered his busy mind. As for me, I have always been proud to call him my best friend. Never had I met a man with such fresh and contagiously dangerous ideas. He was the brain behind most of our mischiefs, but he wasn't the only one who hatched them. The budding cleric Colin de Cailloux and I, Regnier de Montigny, made up the infamous trinity. Although the authorities dreaded us, our classmates applauded us, and as for girls, they were on the constant lookout for rogues, especially those who pretended only to care for the prim gentleman types. One spring afternoon, we set off for the bustling streets of the Latin Quarter right after school, killing time before we attended the birthday party of my cousin, Catherine de Vaucelles. We ended up on Madame Bruyère's lawn. Villon had had it in for the widow ever since she spread a nasty rumor about his mother, Madame Montcourbet, and father Guillaume. Losing his father when he was only 3 years old had left Francois and Madame Montcourbet in despair, constantly moving from one relative to another until they had ended up in the Latin Quarter, where Francois fell ill. Father Guillaume Villon took them in and saved his life. During the days that followed, he developed a fatherly affection for Francois and grew very fond of Madame Montcourbet as well. Bruyère supposed that just because she fooled around with the Holy Fathers herself, so would Madame Montcourbet, but little did she know how chaste that woman was. She was more interested in the Bible than men. Also, unlike some, Father Guillaume took his Christian mission seriously. I was quite certain that even if he had ever developed a romantic affection towards Madame Montcourbet, he never expressed it. Nevertheless, he had become Francois's guardian and raised him as his own son. Bruyère had decorated her lawn with 2 erect stones that were ridiculed mainly because of their obvious phallic shapes. The taller one had a plaque that read, "Devil's Fart." I bet you can imagine why to us students the stones were a daily source of fun. With a jar of ale in our bellies, we became more inspired than ever. While Villon prepared to recite his new poem to the widow, Cailloux acted out a silly scene, moaning like a lustful woman as he pretended to ride the taller stone. I didn't care much for the childish act. As opposed to the fool Cailloux, I was well-mannered. Despite being an impoverished orphan, my noble genes made me a man of honor, pride, and occasional gallantry. My mother succumbed to a dreadful disease, and my father died in the service of the king. Life's lessons had taught me how to blend in with all social classes, but the stuck-up bourgeoisie society was a true challenge. I was accepted to the Sorbonne thanks to my cousins who were both canons at the Saint Benoit church like Guillaume Villon. I had never become used to being a commoner, though. I couldn't ignore the blue blood that pumped through my veins. The city of Paris, the greatest love of my life, eventually robbed me of my status. The only things that kept me looking like a nobleman during my early 20s were my fancy red boots and my greyhound. Had he not had a limp, any gentleman would have been happy to have him. His defect made some think he was not worth it, but I could relate to him, being a fallen noble breed myself. I named him Estienne de Montigny II after my grandfather, and although people made fun of this, he was too smart to take it seriously. The smaller erect stone on Bruyère's lawn was a good spot to sit and polish my red boots. Estienne de Montigny II often licked my boots clean, especially if there was a piece of lard to hand which could be used as a polish. Villon loved to make fun of me as he considered the shiny, luxurious boots a comic contradiction to my shabby clothing. In fact, he found most things about me amusing. He said it was mainly my proud posture and serious nature. I had never really liked being made fun of, but for some reason I didn't mind being his well of entertainment. The truth was that Villon was the only friend who really understood what I was about, and the only friend who always managed to lighten my mood. Therefore, I let him mock me all he liked, as the bastard never meant any harm. Bruyère was also fond of Villon, as were most Parisian women. I understood why, but not in that way, of course, as I myself had always been a desperate admirer of the feminine. However, nobody could overlook Villon's magnetic presence, wittiness, honesty, and most of all his unique way with words. I suppose the dark, pensive eyes and unruly hair helped him in that regard as well. Unlike me, he had never banged his head on door frames, and he had a better physique. When I looked in the mirror, I saw an elegant, bearded parsnip, my lush brown curls making up for the melancholic eyes. Charming as I was, girls always looked at Villon before me. I still had it better than Caillou the Scarecrow, though, as he naturally repelled women, mostly due to his immature behavior. That sunny day, Villon greatly disappointed one of his admirers. Even though Bruyère's eyes gleamed at the sight of him, nothing could prepare her for the poem he had written about her love affair with Father Laurens, who lived next door to him. Casual as always, Villon began to recite the verses. I peeked through the keyhole to find a bed by the fireplace, wide and fine. A plump cannon sprawled on the pillows. Beside him, Madame Bruyère's skirts billowed, as her smooth and soft body let go of her dress. Flesh to flesh for greater pleasure they pressed. I watched them mess around and learned quite easily that for alleviating sorrow it's best to live in luxury. As usual, Villon managed to put a smile on my face. However, Bruyère didn't share my enthusiasm and threatened Villon from her window. You nasty imp! How dare you disrespect a man of God! Her high-pitched yell made the birds fly off her roof. I'm sorry if I've offended you, madame, bowed Villon, and it looked like he was going to apologize before he added, but I'm not the one who disrespects the priest. I go to confessionals to confess, not undress. Oh, how dare you! Be on your way or you'll regret it, she threatened. Villon bowed to her and waved at Caillou and me. Although we were about to leave, Regnier de Montigny II had suddenly decided to top our offenses off by marking the taller stone. That made Bruyère even more furious. She rushed inside her room and was back before we had managed to recover, hurling the contents of her chamber pot at us. Villon and Caillou's reactions were faster than mine, and so I received the full force of her excreta. Bruyère, Villon, and Caillou had a blast, but my faithful Regnier de Montigny II began sympathetically licking me clean. My garments didn't matter to me, they were just old rags. However, my shoes were a different story. When someone dared to touch the only thing I had left of my father, all of the usually suppressed anger broke loose. I swore revenge on Bruyère as I strode off to clean myself at the well, followed by the rambunctious laughter of my companions. Stop laughing, Villon! What will people think of us when we get to the party smelling like a pair of old goats? I don't have enough time to change, not to mention anything to actually change into. I might as well not go. No way, protested Villon. You have to go, stinking or not. People will think I pissed myself, I muttered. You can always blame it on Sermoise. I'm sure he'll be there. Philip Sermoise was a young priest who was often the victim of our shenanigans, simply because he was so gullible. What do you mean? Should I say that he pissed on me? I suppose a more believable lie would be that he pissed himself. Just keep close to him and comment on the awful smell. I grinned but shook my head. I don't know, Villon. I don't even have a present for Catherine. Why don't you take her some wine, suggested Villon. If I buy wine, I'll have to fast for the rest of the week. You mainly eat at my house anyway, pointed out Villon, and we all knew that he was right. If it wasn't for the generous hospitality of Father Guillaume and Madame Moncorbier, neither I nor Regnier de Montigny II would have a bone to chew on. Come on, if you don't have enough, I'll chip in, he offered. I can't keep taking advantage of your hospitality, Villon. I don't mind. As long as I have enough, my money is yours. Friends should help each other, right? Caillou nodded. Of course, you can count on me too, Montigny. The well water washed away some of the stench, but not all of it. I couldn't risk a fever, so left the well before I began to feel too cold. I should start working on Regnier de Montigny II's hunting skills, then I never have to worry about food. Villon laughed. If only he wasn't such a city boy like us. Maybe you should bring more dogs to our pack. What do you think, Estienne? You are old enough to pass on your wisdom to the youngsters. Then you'll have more mouths to feed, remarked Villon. Every nobleman should have at least 3 hounds as companions, I objected, upon which Villon patted my back and said, Before we discuss your noble pack, I just thought of how to get that wine for Catherine for free. He went on to explain his brilliantly simple plan, and as usual, I was all up for it. After we said goodbye to Caillou, Villon and I borrowed 2 identical clay carafes from the Sorbonne. We filled one with water and left one empty, chuckling at the thought of Villon's clever idea. We then hurried to a tavern that was famous for its fine wines and pretended to be experts. Due to my unpleasant smell, Villon dealt with the innkeeper while I secretly held the clay carafe filled with water behind my back. He gave the man the empty carafe and ordered him to bring us his finest white wine. After the innkeeper brought it forth, Villon tasted it and spat it out, claiming that it was undrinkable. The innkeeper argued with him, so he let me have a taste too. I did, and agreed that it was simply disgusting. While the offended innkeeper was arguing with Villon, I exchanged the carafes and hid the one with the wine behind my back again. That's when Villon resolutely grabbed the carafe with water and returned it to the innkeeper who, although upset, poured the contents back into the barrel. On our way to the birthday celebration, Villon and I laughed our asses off at his gullibility. I was glad to have a gift for Catherine and hoped it would make up for my unpleasant smell. As usual, however, I became the object of ridicule before people even caught a whiff of me. Montigny, you look splendid today. Isn't that your grandfather's tunic? Such brilliant pieces never go out of fashion, huh? Laughed one stuck-up asshole upon seeing me. Villon gave me an empathetic smile and said, Don't let envy get to you, my friend. Your genuine nobility shines through even the stinky rags. We both knew that he was just being nice, yet I proudly thrust out my chest and braved it out. Had it not been for the delicious food and fine wines, I certainly wouldn't bother visiting this pretentious herd of marionettes. However, before we could treat ourselves, we had to congratulate the young lady who was celebrating her 16th birthday. It came as no surprise that we found her surrounded by a clutch of suitors, but on the lookout for an escape. Everybody knew that the black-haired doll with cute, freckled cheeks longed only for the one who kept evading her. Catherine de Vousset and Francois Villon would make a curious couple. Both were used to standing out and being the source of gossip, he because of his poetry and she because of her numerous male friends. They liked to tease each other, but nothing more. It was a game they both knew well, and neither one overstepped its carefully defined boundaries. Catherine's father, my uncle, would never bless a union with a random arts student, and even if Villon found himself respectable work, he was not built for a conventional life. A servant guided us to the line of guests waiting to congratulate Catherine. Some remarked on her beauty, especially the artist who had painted her portrait for the occasion, and the successful merchant, Noel Joly, who gave her a necklace to compliment her, in his words, ethereal grace. Approaching her after this slick gentleman felt a little awkward, because neither one of us could afford such an expensive gift. Catherine didn't seem that interested in what we had to offer, though. I suppose that seeing Villon was good enough. Francois, Regnier, she exclaimed heartily, and since we were the last 2 guests to greet her, she took us aside to avoid the eyes of her suitors. Thank you for saving me from all that boring small talk, she whispered. It's our pleasure, said Villon. We couldn't miss celebrating the birthday of the oldest maid in Paris. Splendid, she beamed, unaffected by his words. Though I must disappoint you, Francois, my maidenhood has been compromised by several tempting offers tonight. Don't mind them, he threw out his hand. It would be a sin for a lively spirit like yourself to espouse. Look at all the fine specimens of manhood you'd have to give up for just one match. He smiled at the men watching us, and his gaze lingered over to the vigilant Noel Joly. Shush, Francois, said Catherine, with that pretended innocence which barely concealed the rebellious flame in her eyes. While Noel Joly and Villon carefully eyed each other up, Catherine addressed me. It's nice to see you, Cousin Regnier. She moved a bit closer, then caught the whiff of my soiled clothes and stepped back again. Are you all right, she asked, and her kind concern made me even more uncomfortable. Of course, I proclaimed confidently. To avoid explaining myself, I handed her the hard-earned carafe of white wine and paid my respects. Thank you, Cousin Regnier. She drew a breath, then looked at Villon, curious to see what he had brought. I wondered that myself, as I hadn't even asked him. To our surprise, Villon just showed her his empty hands and said, I bring nothing. Catherine tried to hide her disappointment, but before she could say anything, Villon tapped his right temple and finished, Nothing but my humble rhymes. An excited smile spread across Catherine's face as he went on. I have been memorizing the poem since this morning, and know it by heart now. Catherine fondly squeezed his hands and addressed the rest of the company. Attention, dear guests! Monsieur Villon has written me a poem. Everybody except for Noel Joly cheered along with Catherine. We all knew that Villon never disappointed when it came to his poetry. However, since he was not known for writing polished odes to female beauty, I suspected that the spark in Catherine's green eyes would soon fade away. I watched in apprehension as he cleared his throat and began. This poem came to me as I thought of time's unmerciful passing. Where is she? Can anyone tell me? Flora who blessed Rome with her beauty. And where is Alcipas, or Tai, her firstborn cousin? Where's the echo of their sweet voices? Did it drown in ponds, rivers, and seas? The inhuman beauty, where to has it vanished? Where are the snows of yesteryear? Where is the wise goddess who went by the name Heloi, the castrator of monk Pierre Espilard of Saint Denis? Oh, the poor sinner had suffered his sentence, and where is Queen Marguerite, the seductress? The one who beguiled so many men, then dropped them into the river Seine. Oh, where are the snows of yesteryear? A dramatic bow followed. Sometimes people didn't know whether to praise or condemn Villon. This time, Catherine had the first word, though, as the poem was meant for her. I could tell that Villon was growing uneasy at the sight of her stern face, but luckily for him, she finally clapped and inspired others to follow. Francois, she laughed, had I known you thought so lowly of contemporary women, I would have worn my toga for this occasion. I was surprised and impressed that she had the humor to laugh at herself at that moment. What I have forgotten to add, said Villon then, is that the snows of yesteryear are nothing compared to today's blossom in your cheeks. He bowed to her with that characteristic roguish grin. Sometimes I wondered whether he was aware of the effect he had on women who saw him as a sensitive poet instead of a scoundrel who marked his territory in all the Parisian brothels. Noel Joly seemed to be very aware of Villon's dark side, though, and wasn't going to let him off the hook. Don't you consider the poem a bit cold, Monsieur Villon? One would expect more from a man of your, how to put it, passion. Catherine and Villon looked at each other, and although Catherine was curious as to how he would reply, I noticed that something was troubling her. Villon cheekily raised his eyebrow and answered, Well, I keep my passions tamed, as opposed to some. The angry grin on Joly's face boded no good. Catherine smiled and attempted to end the quarrel. Please, gentlemen, wouldn't it be nicer to enjoy this splendid celebration rather than taint it with arguments? Look, Monsieur de Montigny has brought us some delicious white wine. Help yourself to a goblet and have a taste. She placed my humble gift among the delicacies on the table, and as voices filled the room again, Villon leaned over to Catherine and remarked, Monsieur Joly is as pleasant as usual. I caught a hint of jealousy in his tone. I knew my friend well and was aware that although he regarded Catherine as nothing more than his acquaintance, he still seemed more taken with her than with any other woman. Well, he's been spending a suspicious amount of time at our house recently, admitted Catherine. Father is quite fond of him. And you? I find him a bit too serious, but he's prosperous. I think he might propose soon. I sensed a challenge in her tone, and her curious glance at Villon confirmed it. You would really marry someone like Noel Joly, sneered Villon. Who else should I marry then? You? If I weren't married already, I'd definitely marry you, replied Villon with a courteous bow, and then, as if trying to escape, he promptly left to greet the provost Robert de Estouteville and his wife Ambroge. The couple had grown fond of him after he had written a delightful poem for their wedding. I stayed behind with Catherine, who was clearly bewildered, so I explained, We both decided to marry Paris. She's a fine wife who never disappoints and gives us enough freedom to roam her streets as much as we like. Catherine smiled, but her face showed dejection. Before she went off to mingle, she squeezed my hand and said, Thank you for coming over and for the lovely gift. I know it must have been a great sacrifice. I bowed to her, my hand resting on my chest in gratitude, and moved over to the brimming tables. While stuffing myself, I observed Villon entertaining the influential couple and thought of how well he was doing in this affluent society considering his background. After the boring birthday party, we decided to fill our bellies with ale at Margot's Inn, a tavern with a brothel attached. As soon as we entered, the local madame greeted me with a slap. How many times do I have to tell you to leave your beast outside, Montigny? Have mercy on him, Margot. It's not safe out here. Margot glanced at the poor hound and melted a bit. Can he behave? She asked, hands on her hips. He behaves better than most of the apes who come here. Like yourself, eh? She teased, but then nodded. All right, go on then. Just make sure to make up for it with generous orders. That I could not promise, so I kept quiet. I knew Margot would eventually let it be. Her tough exterior concealed a warm-hearted nature. We all admired Margot, not just for her curves, and were indebted to her for providing us with food, drinks, and girls at a special student discount, as she liked to call it. Her beauty shone out of her cute, round face, golden curls, and pair of dimples. She never shared her age with us, but judging from the few wrinkles on her face, it was clear she was in her mid-30s. After Margot let us in, Villon, Regnier de Montigny II, and I headed over to the table where Colin de Caillou sat with our younger classmate, Guy Tabary, a complete loser in my opinion. Oh, wonderful, the bird brain is here, I couldn't help but mutter to Villon. Be nice to him, Montigny, he winked at me. Remember that we used to be like him once, seeking the company of the older boys. I knew that Villon had developed a kind of big brother relationship with the youngster, and so I learned to tolerate his company. Together we approached the table. Guy Tabary was laughing with his open mouth full of bread and cheese, telling one of his tall tales. Beside him, Caillou was pretending to listen, although his attention was focused solely on the lively maidens who were luring customers to the chambers on the floors above. I hadn't been with one for quite some time, as I had to watch my spending. However, that night Caillou pointed out the newcomer, a goddess with striking brown eyes, hazel hair, and a contagious smile that seemed to be imprinted on her face. Her name was Isabeau, and she was the loveliest girl I had ever seen. Judging by the laughs she exchanged with Margot, I could tell that they were friends. Villon looked distracted and didn't even glance in her direction. I couldn't help but ask him if he was thinking about Catherine, but he patted my back with an earnest laugh and said, If I ever become foolish enough to dream of a girl with such high expectations, hand me a noose straight away. I'd rather end it than end up in a jail called marriage. You could just be lovers, I argued. She once told me that there's nothing worse than binding a free spirit. Then let's drink to her free spirit and pray that Noel Joly will not break it. He lifted his goblet in the air and made a toast with Tabary and Caillou. Just the sight of the pathetic duo made me lose interest in hanging around. I shifted my gaze back to Isabeau, admiring her gentle physique and graceful movements. She didn't fit in with the rest. She was like a fallen star filling our dim world with a bit of heaven. I began to wonder whether she was one of Margot's girls at all. I would definitely skip my meals tomorrow for that one, I whispered to Villon. The girl has me completely hypnotized. It's a shame that she's rarely available, said Villon, throwing his feet up on the chair before us. What do you mean? Margot told me that although she hasn't known her long, she is very fond of her, and will only leave her in trustworthy hands. Whose hands could be more trustworthy than mine, I argued, almost offended by the remark. Villon laughed and continued. There's more. She let her go with Sermoise once, not expecting him to become completely obsessed with her. From then on, he's been here every night, paying a fortune just to make sure that Isabeau goes with no one but him. Then he's an even bigger idiot than I thought. I don't see him around right now, though. I bet he's lurking in the shadows somewhere, grinned Villon. You know how oddly he tends to behave. Let him lurk. I'm ready to take my chance. I stood up, ran my fingers through my curls, and quickly polished my red boots. They still stunk, but I hoped it wouldn't matter to the angelic beauty who had already trapped me in her sweet web. Gentlemen, this one is mine tonight, I pronounced, though first I had to ask for Margot's blessing. She gave it, and so I set off to meet Isabeau, whose eyes locked curiously onto mine, as if sensing I was about to claim her. I was not new to Margot's establishment, and was aware that we students were more appealing to the girls than some of the old drunks. Isabeau's smile widened when I neared her, which helped me regain the confidence I had lost at Catherine's birthday party. Before I could say anything, though, someone crossed my path. Philip Sermoise in all his pathetic glory. I sincerely doubted that he knew how unappealing he looked. I genuinely pitied the priest, though, as we often went too far in teasing him. I often went to his confessional pretending to have sinful thoughts about the sacred statues in his church. Villon's prank was much better, as he once confessed his undying love for the priest himself. He even wrote him some cheesy poems and left him presents at the church. Sermoise was uncomfortable with the situation, but was determined to guide Villon's soul back to light. When the joke became boring, Villon told everyone about it, and Sermoise hated him ever since. One would think he had suffered enough because of our jests, yet we simply could not leave the poor man alone. Father Samoise, what are you doing up so late? Don't you have a mass to celebrate tomorrow? I asked, overshadowing him with my height. Excuse us, Montigny, he muttered nervously. Isabeau and I have a long evening ahead of us. Lord de Montigny, I corrected him with a courteous bow to Isabeau, who rewarded me with an impressed nod. Sermoise jeered at me, though. Ha, Lord! I doubt that you can even afford Mademoiselle Isabeau. She's one of those street whores who go for a sou. She charges more than Margot herself. Isabeau looked me up and down and softly fluttered her long eyelashes. Margot told me that your group has special prices over here. I can afford a full price, my lady, I said firmly, in my mind already begging Villon to lend me the sum. Isabeau hesitated, so I reached for her hand and planted a kiss upon it. She smiled at me, but Sermoise flashed her a furious look as if he owned her. With a defiant look his way, Isabeau accepted my lead and we proceeded to the stairs, when suddenly she stopped and discreetly covered her nose. What's that god-awful smell? I panicked and began stammering. That would be excreta, but not mine. It belongs to a widow who... I paused, realizing how strange that must have sounded. Sometimes I wished for Villon's wits, as my own verbal skills were as bad as my social status. Who what? She asked, the sweet smile fading from her face. It's not worth mentioning. Sensing that he still had a chance, Sermoise stepped in again. I'm willing to pay an additional 10 sous. Isabeau looked at me, wondering whether I could top him. Under normal circumstances, I would have, for she was worth it. But I was discouraged by the foul smell and insults that had followed me that evening. I'm sorry, Lord de Montigny, she said affably. Perhaps next time. Although disappointed, I bowed to her and let her go with the clean sinner. I was used to being let down by girls, but never by a whore. That was a significant blow to my reputation. Margot's girls were the only ones besides my friends whose arms were always open to me. As I watched Isabeau taking Sermoise upstairs to her chamber, the built-up tension within me finally exploded into a wild fury. It's all Brier's fault, I exclaimed as I returned to the table where Villon and his two companions sat. I swear that I'll seek my revenge on her. Villon poured me some ale and tried to console me. Calm down, my friend. Look, Prickly Rose is free now. Why don't you go with her? I'll lend you some money again. I threw up my hand. I've been humiliated too many times today. I'm afraid I would not even be able to perform. Tabari laughed, but I gave him a look that made him stop in his tracks. What kind of revenge are we talking about then? Asked Villon. A one-of-a-kind one, I said, sitting down beside him. Tabari leaned closer to us and said, I say excreta for excreta. We could urinate on the devil's fart. That's stupid, I replied, brushing his idea off and turning to Villon, whose secretive grin suggested that something was brewing in his mind. He remained quiet, though, so Caillou said, We should write her a nasty letter. Villon could compose it. That's no revenge, I argued. I know what we should do, said Villon finally. We all moved closer to him, eager to know what his inner genius was scheming. He let us wait for a moment, teasing us with his impish smile before he blurted out, I say we steal the devil's fart. I liked the daring suggestion immediately, so I embraced him with glee. Now that's a plan. I wish I had thought of that. Careful, Montigny, warned Margot, who had just approached with another load of ale, bread, and cheese. Don't squeeze the life out of him. Indeed, I'll need that, agreed Villon. My lady likes to squeeze tight. Margot stroked Villon's arm and winked at him. He was her favorite, and it wasn't just because of his good looks and charm. She secretly hoped he would write a poem for her one day, and she wasn't afraid of reminding him of it. I'll squeeze even tighter if you heat me up with those promised rhymes, she teased before she left our table. We all gazed after her, addicted to her generous and well-proportioned curves and the way she carried them. But how do we steal the devil's fart? Asked Caillou once Margot had disappeared in the braying crowd. You know how heavy those bloody things are. And we are strong men, aren't we? Challenged Villon, though he wavered a bit at the sight of Tabary. But where would we store it? Argued Caillou again. We could hide it in your room at the Sorbonne, shrugged Villon. Nobody would look for it there. Why my room? It's Montigny's revenge. I don't want to get into trouble. Brier will know we did it and the city guards will not be lenient with us, continued Caillou. That's when I stepped in. Who cares? The provost likes Villon, so you won't make a big deal of it. Trust me, this is a brilliant idea. I lifted my goblet in a toast, and Tabary quickly joined in, promising his help. Only Caillou still seemed skeptical. You three are probably too drunk for rational judgment. School pranks are okay with me, but a real robbery, that's going too far, he said, crossing his arms. I'm highly disappointed in you, Caillou. I thought you of all people would be supportive of such an idea. What do you mean by that? You're the locksmith's son. What does that have to do with anything? Your father surely taught you a trick or two. My father is no thief, he frowned. Locksmiths are bound to be thieves, I replied with conviction. Caillou shook his head. That's such nonsense, Montigny. See the blushing, I teased him. I bet you and your father work those chamber locks whenever you get the chance. Whether it was true or not, Caillou eventually chuckled. I could tell he would agree to help us in the end, so we began scheming our first grand theft. Chapter 2. The Devil's Fart. A few more friends from the Sorbonne agreed to help us with the Devil's Fart theft simply because they found the plan so funny. Therefore, the next day after school we took hold of a few gardening tools and a rope and went on with our plan, not minding that it was broad daylight. We waited until Brie had left the house and began digging out the taller phallic-shaped stone. Her neighbors and people who passed us by wondered what we were doing, but Villon confidently told them, Madame Brie asked us to help her. She wants to have the bigger stone moved upstairs to her bedroom. People probably thought that Brie had lost her mind and just went about their own business. A few street kids helped us with the digging in exchange for some food, and one elderly lady spat on the devil's fart as we dug it up, proclaiming, Thank God that you are ridding our street of this devil's creation, boys. Once the stone was out of the ground, we carried it away with a victorious cheer. But as bad luck would have it, we met Brie on the way. When she saw us with her favorite garden ornament, she began shrieking, You rascals! Put it down! How dare you! We wouldn't give it up, though. Villon grabbed Brie's hand and kissed it. Don't worry, madame. We'll just clean it up and polish it for you so that it may keep you satisfied night after night. Brie slapped Villon, who just laughed at her and continued to help us carry it away. Just then, Brie must have noticed the city guards in the distance as she yelled, Sergeants, over here, help! We hurried on, eager to escape the law. Whether it was God or the devil himself, someone mighty must have been on our side that day, because we managed to bring the stone to the Sorbonne before the sergeants saw us. We then hid the devil's fart under a blanket in my college lodging and drank to our victory for the rest of the afternoon, filling up on the fine claret that Villon had brought. After our little celebration, we went on with our lives as if nothing had happened. However, Brouillet would not let it go. She went to the authorities the next morning, identifying Caillou, Villon, and me as the main perpetrators of the robbery. While we were out, the sergeants searched the whole college and found the stone hidden in my room. Luckily for us, due to the provost's connection to Villon, they let it pass as an innocent student prank. The sergeants must have been greatly disappointed, as they usually seized any chance they could to throw students into the Grand Châtelet prison. The animosity between the Christian church and the law was deeply rooted because both sides wanted to have complete power over the city. The sergeants knew well enough that we students were under the protection of our alma mater, the church, and that's why they hated our guts. They resented the fact that they couldn't bully us like the common citizens, who were powerless when it came to their ruthlessness. For some reason, most of the sergeants themselves were dangerous ex-convicts. We often wondered why this was, but assumed that they needed someone tough in that position. Although I should have been happy that nothing tragic came out of the theft, I simply couldn't help but feel disappointed. My revenge on Brie was not as satisfying as I had thought. On the contrary, I found it quite deflating. To cheer me up a bit, Villon took me to Margot's to drown my sorrows in some ale. Maybe you should just forget about this silly revenge of yours, he advised. We should be happy that the provost saw the funny side. I still think we ought to get it back, I insisted, not ready to give up. However, even Villon seemed reluctant to do this. I don't know, Regnier. Had they not decided to take the stone at the Palace Royal for safekeeping, I might be up for it, but breaking in there would be too risky. Risky or not, I felt a strange urge to pursue it no matter what. In some ways, I didn't even recognize myself. It was as if something had changed within me. With that thought, I noticed Isabeau at the back of the room. She didn't see me and moved gracefully through the sordid tavern like a detached deity. The humiliation I had experienced in her company last time filled me with even more vigor. I shook my head and resolutely said, "I'm not giving up, Villon. I will get the stone back, with or without you." "Don't be foolish," warned Villon. "Just go with that girl that you've got your eye on. She'll make you forget all about it." As he said this, he received a punch in the back. It came from Margot, who loomed over us like a goddess of revenge. "When will you pay your debts, Villon? How much will those promised verses cost me this time?" I realized that Villon was probably receiving his pleasures free of charge again, which was a big honor from the brothel madam who went only with those she really liked. "I work on them each time I lay my eyes on you, dear Margot," said Villon. "But a woman such as yourself, complicated in shape and character, deserves proper research." "Well, it better be worth the wait," she warned, and was patting his head ominously when something stole her attention. We followed her gaze and noticed Sermoise threatening a man who had been talking to Isabeau. Margot's cute, chubby cheeks flushed with displeasure. "You could use a pimp around here," noted Villon. "I don't need any damn pimp. I'm my own pimp." She clamped her hands on her hips and roared, "I've had enough of that puppy love of his. I told him he could have Isabeau as often as he liked, only if he lets her go with others as well. Now look, he is scaring away that wealthy customer." She shook her head in disbelief. "It's too much. I'm fetching my weapons." And with those words, she set off. Villon and I looked at each other equally as worried as amused. We had had the pleasure of seeing Margot in action a few times already, so were painfully aware that she could get rid of a man quite easily, especially one of a rather feeble disposition such as Sermoise. She had never killed anyone, but was quite good at mutilation. No matter how much we teased this silly priest, we never wished him any real harm. We decided to help him out. Villon briskly caught up with Margot. I watched him reason with her from afar. Judging from the fiery spark in Villon's eyes and Margot's laugh, I could tell that he was proposing a better plan of how to chase Sermoise away. Meanwhile, Sermoise was still arguing with the wealthy customer, and Isabeau stood to one side with her arms crossed, waiting for the heated discussion to end. Once Villon had managed to persuade Margot of his plan, he hurried over to the musicians who had been playing a familiar tune. He explained something to them, and when they beamed up at him, I realized he was about to perform one of his songs. He leaped up on the nearest table and resolutely stomped his foot, calling out to Sermoise over the noisy room. "Hey, Sermoise, this one's for you." His words sent a signal to Ithier Marchant, the main performer in the band, who nodded and gave his bandmates a sign to play a well-known melody. The newcomers fell silent in anticipation, but we habitués already knew what would follow. We began to clap along with the drums, and soon Villon started to sing his local hit. "Whether you play false dice, whether you sell indulgence, whether you play wrong or nice, striving for quick abundance, where will all your money go? To the taverns and whores." "Hey," the crowd chimed in. "Rhyme, have fun, play and sing, join brotherhoods of outcasts, play a fool, do a theater, try anything, as long as your audience lasts, but here where all your money should go, to the taverns and whores. Grab your doublets, shirts, boots, and coats, until you stand only in your underclothes, and before things get even worse, take them to the taverns and whores." The whole pub sang along with him, "To the taverns and whores." And Sermoise finally stopped bothering Isabeau and the wealthy customer. Once the song had ended and another well-known melody had begun, Villon jumped off the table and asked Isabeau for a dance. Sermoise's face flushed with anger, but before he could react, Margot and I grabbed him by each arm. Along with Regnier de Montigny II, who was growling at him from behind, we escorted Sermoise out of the tavern. Sermoise knew that we were in control, so he didn't dare to struggle much, though he kept turning after Isabeau. At the door, Margot hissed at the priest, "Go and pray for your sinful soul, father, and know that if you keep harassing my girls, I'll chop off that filthy worm you hide underneath your cassock." She pushed him out into the night and asked him to say a prayer for her on Sunday. Sermoise left, but turned around with a deep frown. The fool had no idea that Villon and I had actually just helped him out, as Margot's punishment would have been a lot tougher had we not intervened. "I don't understand you." Margot shook her head as the priest disappeared in the shadows of the night. "You keep torturing the man yourself, but when it comes to the real thing, you protect him." "Maybe we don't want to lose a good source of amusement," I shrugged and patted Regnier de Montigny II, praising him for helping to scare the priest off. Margot gave him a good-humored look and said, "You were right, Montigny. The beast is tolerable." While Villon and Isabeau danced, I was left sulking in the corner beside Regnier de Montigny II. I assumed her new interest in Villon was due to the eloquent way he had just saved her from the uncomfortable dispute, but also feared she had taken a liking to him. To save me from my jealousy, Villon took his leave of Isabeau and went over to greet Caillou and Tabary, who had just arrived. Isabeau's eyes kept flicking in his direction, so I walked over to her. Sermoise should leave you alone from now on, I said, letting her know that Villon was not the only savior of the day. I hope so, she smiled, then said, I promised my services to the gentleman over there first, but I'm free later tonight if you like. All right, I don't mind waiting if it's worth it. Oh, it is, she confirmed, and added, Lord de Montigny. The words soothed me like honey. I let her go with the wealthy man who had been leering at her, knowing she would be back soon. While Isabeau worked on her customer upstairs, I worked on persuading my friends to help me reclaim the devil's fart. Tabary would do anything we asked him to, but Caillou and Villon still wavered. I ordered more ale, hoping it would persuade them. However, I ended up drinking most of it myself. That's why when Isabeau returned from her duties, I had no energy left in me to take her upstairs and give her my royal treatment. She seemed keen on my company nevertheless, as she agreed to drink some ale with me. I ended up telling her all about our theft of the devil's fart and my secret plan to retrieve it from the Palace Royal. Her reaction surprised me. She found it amusing and even suggested that she might come along, which was all that was needed for Villon to finally agree, not wishing to appear a coward. We told her that it might be dangerous and that we may all end up in the Châtelet, but she was open to the idea nonetheless. I sensed it was because of Villon as she kept eyeing him up, and so I drank to stop myself from thinking about it. I wasn't lucky in love, so when I realized that my interest in this girl was more than just physical attraction, I began to worry. I found myself even more intrigued by her when she suddenly took my palm in hers and started reading from it. She described my past better than I could ever manage myself, and claimed that all good palmists should focus on the past before they foretold the future. Can you read my future now? I asked, partly curious to know more, but mainly just relishing the fact that I had her full attention. I can. I have to warn you, though, I see only the most important parts of the grand plan, and some people are afraid to know them. Well, I'm not, I said bravely. She focused back on my palm, studying the lines in the dim light of the tavern lanterns, when suddenly her expression changed. I could tell that something was troubling her. What is it? I asked, anxious to know what she had seen. She let go of my hand, and it seemed as if she had changed her mind. Nothing, I have a temporary blur. Perhaps it's not the right moment to do this. It's not safe to do palmistry in public anyway. People consider everything to be black magic these days. I could tell that she was avoiding the truth, but I also knew that no matter what she saw in my palm, I couldn't control my fate, so I reckoned I might as well forget about it. Despite being richly intoxicated by the blend of ale, wine, and each other's company, we were all feeling spontaneous that night, and so we decided to go ahead with our second attempt to steal the devil's fart. I feared we would be incapable at first, but the crisp breeze helped us sober up a bit. After crossing the bridge to the right bank, we began to feel stronger, and our minds were clearer as well. We stopped by the well to have a sip of water and firm up our plans. Firstly, we had to figure out how to get past the guards. Isabeau suggested that she could seduce them while we got on with the robbery. We had no doubt that she could keep them busy, so we agreed. A part of me dreaded the idea, but the darker part was simply grateful for the help. I was still confused by why I was so attracted to her. Then again, I had grown to like the opposite of what I was born to be. Commoners tended not to be as pretentious and boring as the upper crust. Villon came up with the plan of pretending to be Isabeau's pimp to keep her safe. I felt ashamed not to be the one to think of it first, but blamed this on the distress and emotional turmoil I had been experiencing that night. I left Regnier de Montigny II on the corner, ordering him to keep guard while Tabary, Caillou, and I hid behind the wall to watch the scene unfold. Villon confidently strode over to the guards with Isabeau by his side. The guards appeared intrigued when he began offering the variously priced services and hesitated over whether to follow their duties or give in to lust. We didn't hear the conversation all that well. However, it was clear that Villon was bargaining with them until they struck a deal. Then Villon took the money, whispered something to Isabeau, and loudly warned the men to treat the girl well, or else he would have to castrate them. He then joined us and reported back. I saw the stone, and there's only one gate to scale. Isabeau will lure the men far enough away so that we can sneak in. What about the keys? Wondered Tabary, confused, an inexperienced thief. We have Caillou, I explained, and nudged the unwilling student. He was still uncertain about whether he had done the right thing by joining us. Breaking into the Palace Royal was, after all, a real crime. Lord, he crossed himself nervously, please don't let my father find out. Your father taught you the skills himself, so if anything, he would be proud, I assured him, but Caillou looked like he was about to vomit, so I simply pushed him forward. Prepare yourself to witness some lock mastery, my friend, whispered Villon to Tabary, whose eyes gleamed at the idea. Caillou finally set off, and we quietly followed him to the palace entrance. As we reached the gate, my gaze fell upon the 3 figures in the shadow of the lanterns. The guards were already preoccupied with Isabeau's body. I didn't like it one bit, and suddenly felt the need to stop the action at once. If I were a more decent man, I would have pulled Isabeau away from them and rushed off with her, but I was a wretch. In order not to change my mind, I focused on Caillou working the locks instead, while Villon and Tabary exchanged excited looks. Such pranks made us all feel alive. We loved the risk that came along with it, though that night was not just a rash student rebellion. It was the threshold between juvenile larking about and criminality, only we hadn't realized it yet. Caillou was soon done, probably because the fear of being caught made him work faster. Before we passed through the gate, I felt Isabeau's gaze on me and turned to check on her. The strange, regretful look in her eyes struck me like an arrow, straight in the heart. I realized it was not right of us to use her like this. She was trying to slow things down for our sake, but one of the guards had already mounted her, and the other hungrily stood by, waiting for his turn. She looked away to avert suspicion, and I took it as a signal to move on. I suppressed the bad feeling her gaze had left me with, and joined my friends who had already snuck into the yard. Without knowing how, we managed to carefully creep out with our trophy, carrying it out into the darkness of the sleeping town. Isabeau, meanwhile, continued pleasuring the 2 men, pressing their heads to her bosom to keep us safe. We had escaped before the guards realized that the stone was gone, and soon we were by the bridge where we had promised to wait for Isabeau. One of us should have stayed and guarded her, I said nervously, after a few too many long minutes had passed. Calm down, Montigny, she's just a whore, said Tabary, trying to sound tough. I grabbed him by the collar and said, and you are just a wimpy little cretin who hangs around Villon just to seem more important. Villon pulled us apart. Stop it, you 2. We are supposed to be brothers in crime. Without saying as much, Villon was like an older brother to us all, the one we always turned to and listened to in the end. I let go of Tabary's collar and was turning away when at last we saw Isabeau running towards us. Villon welcomed her with a grateful embrace, thanked her, and gave her the pimp's money he had kept for her. Thank you for putting up with those 2 stinky dogs, he said. They can never compare to dogs, I argued, and patted Regnier de Montigny II, who had begun to walk ahead of us, probably offended by Villon's comment. You'll have to apologize, Villon. You know how sensitive he is. They all laughed at me, and when I noticed that Isabeau chuckled as well, I couldn't help but join them. I put my arms around Villon and cheered. And now let's go and celebrate our victory. Everybody agreed, so we proudly lifted the stone and marched back towards the Sorbonne. As we passed Bruyère's house, Villon came up with an even more outrageous idea. To steal the other stone as well. Feeling invigorated and brave, we were all up for it. Since that stone was smaller and not as deeply buried, we managed to loosen it up and pull it out without any tools. To top it off, we all urinated on her doorstep except for Isabeau, who just shook her head at us. Regnier de Montigny II completed our revenge by marking the spot as well. Then Villon and I took hold of the bigger stone and left the small one for Caillou and Tabary. Isabeau strode ahead of us, encouraging us to fearlessly march on. We were slower that time as we had fewer helping hands, but the sight of the goddess leading the way certainly made us move faster. Once both of the phallic-shaped stones were in my room, we realized that since there could be only one devil's fart, we should name the smaller stone as well. Villon came up with the title Cushion Fart, and we found it so hilarious that we instantly christened it with some burgundy. We continued celebrating until dawn, drinking and chatting, mainly telling Isabeau about our previous pranks. After Caillou and Tabary fell asleep in each other's arms like lovebirds, Villon, Regnier de Montigny II, and I decided to take Isabeau back to Margot's. We had already sobered up and had more energy than usual due to the adventure we had just had. As was common after our drinking sprees, we were preparing to go to bed just as everyone else was waking up, but that morning was different. I felt as though I could stay awake even longer with Isabeau by my side and hoped that I would. Villon sensed that I wanted to be alone with her, so he headed back to his home at Port Rouge. Once Isabeau and I were the only two thieves walking the early morning streets of Paris, we fell strangely quiet. She was probably tired, but I was mainly confused about the way she made me feel and awkward about what had happened earlier. "I'm sorry about what we put you through," I said with a sincere look. "I wish we had gone with another plan." "Why?" she asked. "You know that I earn my living this way." She proudly patted her cleavage where her financial reward was tucked and added, "Although he's no Margot, Villon makes a good pimp." Still, the guards weren't very appealing. She shrugged. "I'm used to it. They were better than Sermoise. The man has no shame. I wish the faithful sheep at his church could witness the despicable things he made me do." I frowned at the idea. "Did he hurt you?" Isabeau shook her head. "Margot would kill him if he laid a hand on me, but—" She hesitated, and when she saw the bewilderment in my eyes, she just smiled and said, "He's just peculiar, that's all." The idea of perverted Sermoise sickened me, and the sight of her fragile disposition made me feel painfully protective of her. She seemed so gentle and unfit for her craft, but I assumed it could have been because she was new to it. "I thought he was obsessed with you because he's in love." "Oh, he's not in love, he's in lust. But I genuinely don't think he knows the difference," she laughed. "Well, don't worry, my lady," I said, attempting to be courteous. "I will make sure that he haunts you no more." Isabeau gave me a grateful, though slightly distrustful look. "I hope you don't mind me asking," I said after a moment's hesitation, "but I keep wondering why a graceful young woman such as yourself would turn to Margot for survival. You are clearly more sophisticated than the others." Isabeau smiled at some distant memory and began to explain. "My family was well off, but they all passed away during the plague. I was the only survivor, and since then I have had nothing and no one to rely on. I came to Paris in search of my distant aunt. She was the one who taught me palmistry, which was useful to earn a few sous after she passed away. It was not enough, though. Paris can be cruel." I nodded, sympathizing with her, but remained quiet to let her speak. "I began to grow hungry after a few months living on the streets. Margot found me at my lowest and took me in. She has been a wonderful friend to me since. She takes such good care of me. Sometimes the girls are jealous, but I try to be friends with all of them. Margot makes us feel as if we are part of one family. Maybe I was born to be a whore, who knows? Had I married for money, I would be a whore as well, just a more hypocritical one. At least I have some freedom at Margot's." Margot always says, if a woman wants to be free, she can either be a rich widow, a whore, or a witch, but a whore who has less chance of ending up being tortured or burned at the stake. I think she's right. She checked my reaction. I felt even more enchanted by her having heard her backstory, so I finally dared to say, "I have never met a woman like you, Isabeau, and I have a feeling that I never will." She smiled, but I could tell that my confession made her feel slightly uncomfortable. Was it because of Villon? Did she like him better? Although it would not surprise me, I didn't want to be left disappointed, so I refrained from asking. I looked up to the sign above us and realized we were already outside Margot's. "Thank you, Regnier de Montigny. You are a good man," said Isabeau. Then she planted a quick kiss on my cheek and hurried inside the house, leaving us on the doorstep. "You are a good man." I kept repeating her words in my mind. Never had I heard anyone say that to me before, especially the gentler sex. I was surprised how good it felt. At that moment, I wanted to believe that it was actually true. Chapter 3. Criminal Minds. The next day, Villon dragged me to Sermoise's mass. As Parisians gathered by the church, I took the chance to polish my red boots. Villon noted that I did it excessively, but the reason I cared for the two beauties so well was because they were all I had left of my inheritance. I also prepared Estienne de Montigny II to wait outside. He was used to it, and unlike me, he had no objections about dogs being excluded from the house of God. As we made our way to the queue of people, we noticed that Catherine de Vaucelles and her father had arrived. Catherine's eyes gleamed at the sight of Villon, and she headed for us straight away, while my uncle mingled with his own kind. Unlike Catherine and her mother, who had sadly died in childbirth 16 years ago, he kept his distance from me. I suppose he felt ashamed for not taking me and my sister in after our parents passed away. I once told him that I held no grudges. My sister married into a wealthy family soon after, and I was better off on my own anyway. Still, he had been awkward around me since. "You two wouldn't miss Father Sermois's Mass, would you?" smiled Catherine, well aware of how much we enjoyed teasing him. "What is it going to be this time? Tell me what is it going to be so I have something to look forward to." "That would spoil the surprise," winked Villon. "I don't like surprises," she complained. "I prefer to know where I stand." The words had a clear subtext, however, he pretended not to notice. "Maybe we haven't planned anything," he said evasively. Catherine rolled her eyes and sighed. "Always mystifying or lying." "Oh, I may mystify from time to time, but I never lie," said Villon, looking her in the eye. I could tell it made her as nervous as me. I always felt like the odd one out in their presence, especially when they exchanged those puzzling long stares. Luckily, my uncle had just approached and broke the tension. "Good day to you, Regnier," he nodded to me and quickly turned to Villon. "And to you, Francois. How is Father Guillaume doing? We haven't seen him around for quite some time." "He is well, thank you for asking, Monsieur de Vaucelles. My mother takes good care of him, in a completely innocent way, of course." We all knew that Villon was hinting at the rumor spread by Widow Brouillet, who suggested that they shared more than just a household. "And how is school?" he asked me, just to be polite, since it was obvious that he only came over to fetch his daughter. I didn't really care about his lack of concern, but it felt good to be worthy of a question or two sometimes. "Good, thank you for asking, Uncle," I said. "We will be graduating this year, and I'm sure I don't speak only for myself when I say that the freedom it will bring is highly anticipated." "But freedom is not free, Regnier," argued my uncle. "Being torn from the comfort and ease that you have become accustomed to will be quite difficult. You mark my words. If you ever find yourself in trouble, though, don't hesitate to stop by for advice." Of course, just advice, I laughed bitterly to myself. Although my uncle may have not meant it in a bad way, it sounded like he didn't believe in me at all. He wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. My professors often suggested that I should enjoy my school years while I could, because if I chose not to be a cleric, I would find myself with nothing but a useless degree. Master of Arts. I recalled how fancy it had sounded to me a few years ago. Villon paid no heed to my uncle's words. He was whispering something to Catherine, and she was giggling despite her father's reproachful looks. Probably because of that, Noel Joly suddenly interrupted us. He greeted us all except for Villon. Catherine smiled apologetically at him, and so did my uncle. We quietly decided it would be better to go, and so bid them both a polite farewell. There was no need to compete with Noel, as Villon already knew that he had Catherine's attention, and even more so at the end of Mass. Just as Sermoise was blessing the chalice and taking a ceremonial sip of holy blood, his face contorted into an unpleasant grimace. I was the only one who knew that Villon had secretly snuck into the church before Mass and replaced the red wine with some real blood that he had purchased from the butcher's beforehand. Sermoise seemed confused at first, so he took another small sip just to make sure his mind wasn't playing tricks on him. The shock of realizing what he had just consumed made him spit it out again, staining both his vestments and the altar. The congregation gasped in shock, and Villon and I had to suppress our laughter. Catherine discreetly turned our way and smiled, having the same difficulty containing herself. On the way back to the Sorbonne, we were still laughing at Sermoise and the unforgettable expression on his face when he tasted the blood for the second time. The closer we got to our college, though, the more concerned I became about the issue that my uncle had brought up earlier. I asked Villon what he thought of it. "He was right," he said. "I often find myself pondering this. Unless we become clerics, there is not much use for us out there. We don't have any practical knowledge or skill, and the only thing we are good at is philosophizing and coming up with new schoolboy pranks. Better face up to it. We are good-for-nothing fellas." "Not all of us," I objected. "You have always been good at studying and writing." "But what's the use," he said with a careless smile. "Just to impress my friends or the girls?" "Impressing people is a damn good quality to have, Villon. Look at the provost, for example. It was because of the impressive poem you wrote in his honor that we have been pardoned for offenses that others would pay harshly for." He shrugged, then threw his arm around my shoulders and pronounced cheerfully, "Let's make a promise to each other, Montigny. Even if we become utterly non-prosperous and insignificant after our alma mater kicks us out, let's at least enjoy our youth while we can. I understood his reckless approach, but didn't share it. Unlike him, I had nowhere to go and no family to rely on. My sister was glad to be rid of me, my uncle offered only useless advice, and my cousins couldn't give me more than the education I had already wasted. Villon, on the other hand, knew that if the worst came to the worst, Guillaume would be there to support him. Though he wasn't rich, he had some resources and loved him to death. I suppose I should take life as it comes, I said. The world is full of surprises, so if we should ever feel unwelcome here, we can simply move on. There are more cities like Paris out there. I dare to disagree with that statement, objected Villon. There is no place like Paris. I'll never set foot anywhere else unless my life depends on it. Paris. My relationship with the city was as affectionate as it was bitter. Sometimes it cradled me in its safe arms, while other times it thrust me into its lowest pits. Villon loved the city unconditionally, despite all the hardships we had witnessed there. It wasn't just due to the 100 Years' War. Soon after Paris and its vicinity had been liberated, all neighborhoods were plunged into the most dreadful winter. It snowed for 40 days straight, and as a result, thousands of people froze and even more starved to death. Just as we thought the worst was over, we suffered a terrible famine, windstorms, and finally a fatal epidemic that killed tens of thousands, including my poor mother. As if this wasn't enough, packs of starved wolves then attacked the outskirts of Paris, devouring the frailest citizens and leaving only the strongest behind. As Guillaume once said, God must have been angry with this country for a long time to sacrifice so many innocent souls. The fact that Villon and his mother survived through all these tragedies in such poor conditions was a miracle of its own, but an even bigger one was that Father Guillaume had taken pity on them at their lowest moment. He said it was because he saw something unique in the young Francois. He called it a spark that should be handled carefully, not destroyed or burnt out. Villon laughed at the metaphor and said it must have been the infernal fire of his sinful soul that Guillaume had sensed. My friend had a tendency to make light of the darker times in his life. He buried all the misfortunes he had experienced deep inside and never dragged them out. However, he once wrote something that made me realize that it had had an effect on him nevertheless. It went like this. Necessity makes people vile, just as hunger drives wolves from the wild. When Villon and I entered the Sorbonne that afternoon, we were speechless. The college was a complete mess. There were clothes lying around, books, broken jars, spilled ink, and all kinds of household objects strewn about. Our classmates were busy cleaning up, and the professors stood around overseeing the scene with worry etched on their faces. Everyone looked up as we entered, and judging from the cold reception, it was clear that whatever had happened must have been connected to the two phallic-shaped stones. We also noticed that many of our fellow students, including the youngest ones, were badly bruised, and some were even limping. We were both in shock at first, but Villon snapped out of it faster than me, and rushed to find out what was going on. The professors who had initially found the prank amusing were now disconcerted, as they hadn't expected such a response from the law. The city guards had finally got their chance to treat the university with disrespect, and had thoroughly enjoyed it. Only one of the professors was willing to talk to us about it. The sergeants came in to claim the stones. Most of them were drunk and behaved like brutes. Caillou and Tabary were taken to the Châtelet for further investigation, and the rest of us were pushed around. They even stole some of our food and wine. How dare they? Exclaimed Villon, fuming, while I hovered beside him, feeling ashamed. They dare to because they can, replied the professor with a reproachful look. But the theft was just a silly joke. Silly or not, there is a line between a prank and a crime. I wanted to say something, apologize, explain, but remained speechless. The church and university can only go so far to protect you, warned the professor. The law is a force of its own, especially when it comes to criminal records. You may be safe from prison or the noose while you are students here, and you can plead the benefit of clergy even after you leave these walls, but you should be smarter than to give the city guards a reason to come after you. His eyes became softer when he saw our abashed faces, so he went on to explain. I was also young once. I can relate to the mischievous ideas that fill your heads. However, sometimes it's wiser to not execute them. While we both silently searched the ground, the professor concluded his reproof with the strict command, "Help the other boys. That's the least you can do after the suffering and shame you have caused them." The professor liked Villon. Most of them did, because he was one of the best students at the Sorbonne, even though he often lacked good sense and judgment. For that reason, they didn't punish us as they otherwise should have. Villon and I looked at our younger friends with a great deal of embarrassment and regret. It was mortifying to know that they had to deal with the consequences of our actions. We insisted on cleaning the halls up by ourselves, and as we went on with our work, we realized how arrogant and foolish we had been to think that the theft, no matter how innocent and funny it seemed at the time, would go unpunished. Moreover, I felt as if we had just received a second warning about our inauspicious futures that day. We spent the rest of the afternoon tidying up and sulking, feeling especially bad for Caillou and Tabary, as they had taken the blame for us in the most drastic way. Luckily, the two unfortunates returned the following morning. Nothing had happened to them because of the benefit of clergy, but a night in prison and the horror they had witnessed there was enough to scare them off. Although they both swore they would never do anything criminal again, I sensed that they didn't really mean it. In fact, I feared that this was just the beginning of our inevitable life of crime. Despite the chaos that the sergeants had caused for us, their hands were tied when it came to the more serious reprisals. More than ever before, I realized how powerful the Catholic Church was, and how lucky I was to have been taken under its wings. Church leaders clearly had the final word when it came to criminality, perhaps because many of them were criminals themselves. I also began to feel a familiar outrage. The city guard's arrogance astonished me, and my thirst for revenge was awakened once more. However, I no longer wanted to tease some nasty widow or the sergeants themselves. I was ready for a more powerful enemy. That night at Margot's, we lifted our goblets in unison to honor our university, and then I began my impassioned speech. "We can't let the city guards push us around as if we were their puppets," I said. "What they did to you all is unforgivable. We stole and they came for justice, but when they stole from us, no justice came for them. That's why Villon will write a petition to the provost, an official complaint about the bad behavior of its sergeants." My classmates' cheers gave me the confidence to continue. "They hate us because they can't touch us. The benefit of clergy is our biggest, if not only, advantage, my friends. Only students can get away with the same shit as the holy men. Just ask any graduate you can see around here." Before I could finish, I found myself distracted by the sight of Isabeau, who was descending the staircase with a neatly dressed man. They kissed goodbye, and she waved after him without even glancing in my direction. I promised myself to shake her from my mind. I needed to distract myself, and another prank would be the one way to do it, so I went on. "Let's not forget that many of the sergeants are ex-convicts themselves. Most of them were thugs or even murderers before they were employed by the law to do its dirty work. It's unfair. We can't let them turn an innocent joke into a crime. Don't we have the right to a bit of fun? We are young. We are their future. Therefore, we should show them what that future is about. It's not about rules and limitations. It's about freedom and laughter. We are protected by the holy, mighty, and indestructible Catholic Church, yet the law dares to treat our university with disrespect. It's blasphemous." Those last words made everybody cheer again, and soon they all started to chant, "Blasphemy! Blasphemy!" Since most of our fellow students were on their way to becoming clerics themselves, we had finally touched on a core principle, which was the need to protect their faith. I noticed that familiar spark of rebellion in Villon's eyes and reacted to it like a hungry wolf. We were born to be crooks, no matter how much we liked to hide beneath the cloak of intellect. That part of us seemed to appeal to Isabeau as well, who had finally joined us. "Hello, boys. So what are we scheming today?" Everybody turned to her in surprise. The fact that she was still invested in our mischief and even encouraging it simply astonished us. Nobody could disappoint that beautiful face, and so in no time we began planning another brilliant escapade. We decided to rearrange the tavern and shop signs around Paris so that they united in symbolic couples. The Golden Goose would marry Robert the Locksmith, the Stag, Louis the Tailor, the Silver Goblet, the Red Rose, and so on. It was childish but seemed ingenious in our drunken state. What mattered most was that we had plenty of fun doing it. Isabeau joined us like the last time, but didn't pay much attention to me. She hung around Villon instead, which made me finish off the wine jar that was meant to last for the whole evening. Estienne de Montigny II helped me regain my composure a few times, and it was mainly thanks to him that I was able to keep up with the group. As if some wicked fortune had planned it, Sermoise emerged from the shadows of the narrow streets just as we were pairing the dirty goat with the blacksmith Fournier. It seemed that he had been following us the whole time, because he wasn't at all shocked by what we were doing, and just stood there with a frown. Villon and I exchanged a troubled look. We both knew that he had plenty to seek vengeance for, so had to stop him before he reported us to the authorities. Villon, who was not as drunk as I was, called out to him. "Come out of hiding, our virtuous friend. Come have a drink with us. We celebrate your institution tonight. God bless the church." The others joined in as if it was one of Villon's songs. "God bless the church." Although Villon's invitation was sincere, Sermoise probably assumed that we were all mocking him. I could only make out half of his face in the dimness of the narrow street, but the hatred in his eyes broke through it nevertheless. "I'd rather die of thirst than share a drink with you," he replied, unable to suppress his hatred. "Please," begged Villon with a friendly smile, "I would like to take this opportunity to apologize for everything, and I'm certain that Regnier feels the same way. We both realize that we often go too far. Would you find it in your heart to forgive your brothers?" Sermoise spat on the ground and hissed, "You are no brothers to me." Then he fixed his gaze on Isabeau and said, "I thought you were better than this, Isabeau. There will come a day when you will regret the way you treated me." With those cold words, he disappeared into the night. We all had a bad feeling about the brief encounter, for it felt like a clear warning. We guided Isabeau home and told Margot about Sermoise's threat. I was mainly concerned for her safety. However, I also couldn't help but wonder whether Sermoise had a deeper reason to warn Isabeau that night. Did he know something I didn't? After we parted from the two worried women, I gathered the courage to ask Villon about Isabeau. "Don't worry, Montigny," he laughed. "I would never dare touch your girl." Though I was relieved to hear him say the words, I was too proud to admit it. "She's not my girl. I was just curious, that's all." "She could be," argued Villon, "if you stop drooling from a distance and take action." I felt like a boy who had been caught stealing bread. How strange that theft caused me less shame than showing my emotions. That was why I hid my blossoming feelings for Isabeau behind the idea that she only appealed to my more carnal instincts. "Who would want a whore to be his girl?" I asked Villon, but mainly myself. "I suppose only an unfortunate like you, my friend," he said, embracing me like a brother. Chapter 4. Dance of the Dead. The plan seemed reasonable. Villon wrote the petition to the provost and decided to deliver it personally along with his classmates, including me, Caillou, and Tabouri. Thank God I left Estienne de Montigny II at my college room that day, as he may have not survived what followed. On our way, we snickered at the merchants and publicans who were losing their temper over the rearranged signs. Most Parisians found it funny, but those affected by it were cursing the rapscallions responsible. The city guards, including the sergeants who had broken into the Sorbonne, had come to their aid. I couldn't help but glower at these lowlifes which attracted their attention. Villon elbowed me, advising me to stop staring at them. Though I knew he was right to worry, I just couldn't help myself. We stumbled upon the provost even before we reached the Grand Châtelet, which was also his place of residence. "Monsieur Francois Villon," he proclaimed rather warmly considering the situation. "Have you come for your punishment?" The reproachful tone hid the fact that he was still fond of him. "Actually, Monsieur de Estouteville," bowed Villon, "we come to you with an official complaint." He handed him the sealed letter. "My classmates, professors, and I were shocked by the barbaric way our college was treated." "All right, I promise to read your petition, but you must promise me something in return." "Stop provoking us if you can't handle the repercussions. And go and help the shopkeepers. We know it was you who messed with the signs." "I promise we will, sir," said Villon with another courteous bow. The provost nodded and flashed us all a warning look. We felt relieved and grateful for his lenience, and so we headed to the left bank. By the time we reached the Notre Dame bridge, Villon began to sense that we were being followed. He wanted to return to the Châtelet, but I argued with him, encouraging everybody to carry on, foolishly thinking that nothing could happen to us if the provost had treated us so well. We crossed the Ile de la Cité and stepped onto the Notre Dame bridge, flanked by rows of tightly packed wood and daub houses. However, when we neared the left bank, I grew uneasy as well. Something was up. I felt it in the stone structure below and in the thick air above. The sun seemed to hide behind the clouds, and the birds began circling us, already sensing that blood would be shed. Villon and I were the leaders, and so we gestured to everybody to speed up. Suddenly, a group of sergeants blocked our path. Their solid bodies created a barrier at the bridge's end. They were armed to the teeth and with various weapons, and their eyes burned with rage. Villon and I looked at each other, fear clutching us both in its chilly claws. We instinctively turned around and hurried our friends back towards the Ile de la Cité, only to be met with another line of sergeants guarding the other end of the bridge. We were trapped halfway between the two banks, surrounded by rows of quiet houses on each side. We turned back and forth in despair. We didn't stand a chance. I reached for the dagger that I carried tucked in my shoe, always ready to fight and protect my life, honor, and friends. The others took it as a sign and drew out anything that could pass for a weapon, be it a pocket knife or just a book. We must have looked pathetic to them, and this was reflected in their sneers. I pulled on the door of the nearest house. Even though the houses might have been open before, they were carefully locked now as the siege got underway. Faces appeared in the windows, looking out at the scene with the thrill of anticipation. It was the dawn of a street battle between unarmed students and bloodthirsty sergeants. The people made me sick, for they could have helped at least a few of us, yet had clearly decided not to. If someone were to die that day, they wouldn't be seen as accomplices. They would simply be able to walk away. I had witnessed such ignorance many times before in my life, but that instance changed something within me. My whole being realized that we lived among herds who went along with whatever the authorities decided. Only a few rebelled against it, and I wanted nothing more at that moment than to be one of them. As the sergeant slowly approached us, enjoying the idea of our imminent loss, I turned to Villon for help. If we had ever been in need of his clever ideas, it was then. I could tell that his mind was racing, but we didn't have enough time for an exchange. It all happened too fast. The bridge became a sea of struggling bodies, punching and kicking each other, pushing and roaring. I used my dagger without hesitation, slashing our enemies as they wickedly attacked the least armed of our friends. Whether I injured 1 or 10 men, I did not care. I just kept checking on Villon and Caillou. I lost sight of them after one of the sergeants attacked me, and I escaped his spear only by luck. I was frantically trying to locate my 2 best friends while struggling to help the others. As blood splashed on my face, I noticed that one of the younger students had fallen to the ground with a scream of horror, blood gushing from his stomach. The sergeants trampled him, until one of them mercilessly finished him off. I raged towards the brute, stabbing my dagger into his back and receiving a dagger strike in return. I hardly felt the impact, and in the rush of fury, assumed it was just a scratch. When my opponent collapsed on his knees with my dagger stuck in his back, I moved away, looking for a way out of the hell. I was still desperately trying to locate my friends amidst the splashing blood, screams, and clashing metal. I once again caught sight of the gaping faces in the windows. Some were terrified, some concerned, others struck by a bloodthirsty fascination. Only one emotion united them all: fear. Then, by luck, I spotted Caillou and Tabary crawling on top of a nearby house, successfully reaching the chimney. They ran across the rooftops towards the left bank. I was impressed by the clever idea, but couldn't join them without Villon. I had to find him first, armed or not. With this in mind, I fell on my knees and proceeded to crawl through the fighting bodies. I saw one of my classmates on the ground with a fatal wound. As his eyes met mine, I could sense his life slowly fading away. Never had I seen a man in such pain before. Never had I felt death's chilling breath so close to me. The most horrifying realization struck me then. This was my fault. I had brought them all to this utter misery. If that boy had to die, so should I. The root of the tragedy. After his spirit finally left his poor body, I froze as if in some kind of daze. I became numb and everything around me slowed down. I saw my end mirrored in the blade that stuck out of his chest. I was ready to rise and dance the last round with my Lady Death, but before I managed to put my red boots to use one last time, somebody pulled me up and pushed me inside of one of the houses. Did one of those cruel bystanders finally decide to take pity on us? With this puzzling thought, I looked around, expecting to see a merciful stranger, but instead I faced Villon. He locked the door and turned to the person beside him. I was quite certain that I had seen the man before at Margot's, as one could hardly forget such a character. He looked like the specter of some ancient warrior. His head was bald, he had a long, braided beard, and his face was covered with old scars. His deep wrinkles complemented the tough expression on his face. They belonged to him like bark on a tree. The contrast between his rough appearance and noble attire was uncanny and somehow appealing. In a way, he reminded me of myself. He looked like an impoverished nobleman trying to wear his defeat with pride. He introduced himself as Jean de Loup, but said that he mainly goes by the name of Wolf. Villon patted me on the back, then immediately rushed over to the window. "We must help the others too," he insisted. "Have you lost your mind? It's enough we risk our lives for this one," said Wolf with a distrustful glance in my direction. "If those sergeants see us hiding here, we're dead. Heroism is useless when you're outnumbered. Unless you are a highly skilled fighter, which judging by what I've seen, you are not, you either escape or you lose your life." "But they are suffering for our mistakes. We must help them. Is there a secret door or something?" asked Villon in despair, still trying to find a way to save at least a few more lives. "I'm not risking my life for a third time. If you do something foolish, I'll have to take action." They exchanged a strained look. I noticed Wolf easing the dagger out of his belt, so I gave a slight shake of the head, warning my friend to stand back. Villon muttered something and turned away from both of us. His eyes were crazed, and his limbs wouldn't stop shaking. He was consumed with guilt and anger. I understood his inner struggle so well. We had become the cruel bystanders, and I felt sickened by it. Wolf was unaffected, though. He must have been used to such horrors. "I've seen you at our tavern a few times," he remarked. The expression "our tavern" baffled us both. Villon didn't respond, but Wolf kept on talking to him. "You're the poet Margot keeps talking about, right? I enjoyed your ditty the other day." Someone's painful scream startled us all. Villon and I exchanged looks, united in helplessness and shame. We had been brothers in crime, now we were brothers in death. "Try not to listen," advised Wolf. "It will ease your mind. It takes time to make peace with this, but the pain will cease sooner or later." Suddenly I began to feel weak, so I leaned on the wall for support. It was becoming difficult for me to focus, and the chamber seemed to be spinning. I felt as though I were trapped in a feverish nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. "Are you all right?" asked Wolf at the sight of my limp body. I nodded, but my waist felt strangely moist to the touch. At first, I thought I had spilled red wine on myself, though the liquid was thicker than that. It was only when I noticed Villon's terrified expression that I realized I was wounded. The shock had probably blocked out the pain. As I touched the wound, however, I began to remember the sting of the blade. It all dawned on me then. I was injured in exactly the same spot as the boy that I had witnessed passing away moments before. With that dreadful memory, I succumbed to panic, and everything turned black. The flickering of a candle woke me up. I remembered why I had blacked out and checked my injury straight away. It was carefully secured with a white cloth, and to my relief, clear of blood. "Don't touch it. It's clean and sewn," said Wolf. "Where am I?" asked in a daze. "Still at my house," he replied, and pushed a goblet to my lips. "Drink up. It will make you forget about the pain." I obeyed and drank the bitter medicine, although I couldn't feel the wound anymore. At least not until I tried to sit up. "The wound isn't deep, but you have lost a lot of blood, and you may feel weak and dizzy over the next few days." "Where's Villon?" I asked, alarmed. "Over there," Wolf nodded in the direction of the window. "Still feeling guilty and waiting for you to recover." Only then did I notice Villon hunched by the wall with his head down. Wolf set the goblet down on the table and eased himself into the armchair opposite. The gloom around us distressed me. "How long have I been out?" I asked. "For some time," answered Villon. The dark tone in his voice surprised me. Never before had I seen him so dismal. It discouraged me from feeling grateful to be alive. Wolf poured me a better medicine then and encouraged me to have a taste. "Don't be like your friend and refuse such a quality wine." We both looked in Villon's direction, but he wouldn't budge, so Wolf continued speaking. "I keep telling him that although it may have been your fault that you were attacked today, it's not your fault that they died. How can you be blamed for that? From what I know, your only crime was a set of innocent practical jokes." "How come you know so much about us?" I asked. "Have you never noticed me at my tavern?" "You mean Margot's?" Wolf laughed. "Since when do women own such establishments?" "Well, Margot seems like she could handle it," I answered with honest admiration. "True," he agreed. "I'm just the owner and protector. She keeps the place in order. That's why I call it Margot's Inn." "Are you her husband?" He shook his head resolutely. "I'm not the marrying type. Margot is my sister-in-law. After my brother passed away, I let her do whatever she wanted with the place. She thought that turning it into a tavern with a brothel attached would be good revenge for the abuse and heartache that he caused her. Why do you live here if you own that house? Are you that rich? He smiled and shook his head. A river bailiff doesn't earn much. But a courtyard does, Villon finished firm and finally turned to face us. How do you know? Asked Wolf, confused. The symbol on your tunic, explained Villon. Margot told me about you coquillars. I followed my friend's gaze and noticed the embroidery. It depicted a cockleshell. Who are the coquillars? I inquired, anxious to know what they were talking about. A gang of criminals who are paid to steal, rape, and kill, said Villon with a disgusted glare at Wolf, who responded with a grin. Some gratitude. I know your help comes at a price, fired back Villon. Wolf laughed at his daring and admitted, It's true that I have had my eye on your group for quite some time, mainly because I have always found your antics quite clever, at least up until today. Villon's frown deepened into a scowl, but Wolf paid it no mind and continued. We are a very private group, though, so a man has to earn our trust before he can be a part of the Brotherhood. Villon looked at him in distrust, but I became alert. Crime seems to follow us every step these days, I mused. Could destiny be showing us the right path? Go ahead and take that road, said Villon bitterly. I'm done with all this. His judgmental tone worried me. Do you think I don't regret what happened out there? I couldn't help but raise my voice. Villon firmly shook his head. I know you do, and I also know that you can do better than spend your time scheming revenge. We are students, not criminals. Not criminals, I laughed, despite my physical and emotional pain. How can we not be criminals if everyone around us is? Look at our professors and the mysterious gifts they receive. Look at all those priests selling indulgences and whoring around. And look out there at what the so-called justice and law did to us. Villon turned away from me. He didn't like arguments, especially between friends. The sergeants who attacked you will pay, said Wolf. I know both sides, law and crime, and there is no way that the provost ordered them to do this. The law is not as powerful as you may think. It's the church that should not be messed with. He looked at me in all seriousness then. Villon is right. There is a fine line between justice and revenge, but you are right as well, Montigny. There is corruption in all the institutions we are supposed to look up to, so one has to learn how to play along. Don't listen to him. He's just trying to recruit new members, warned Villon. Wolf just laughed at him, though. I don't need to recruit anybody. There are countless men out there who want to be a part of our gang. Like I said, I took a liking to your group, but the decision is up to you. What I did for you today comes with no strings attached. I am a man of my word, no matter how corrupt I may seem. Villon looked at me as if wondering what I made of it all. I was too wary to think, though, and was certain about only one thing at that moment. Whatever I ended up becoming, I would never be on the side of the law again. For the 3 days that followed, our classmates' blood was slowly washed away, and when the rain stopped, we visited the Notre Dame Bridge to pay our respects to them. We lit candles and lanterns, said prayers and promised to keep their memory alive. Passing strangers joined us. Others just stood aside, watching the sad scene from a respectable distance. I recognized a few of the faces from the bridge among them. They obviously regretted not helping us while they had the chance. I made peace with them in my heart, though, as I ended up being one of them in the end. I realized they were afraid to risk their lives and those of their family members for some students they didn't even know. No one felt guiltier than me about what had happened. I was the one who needed to apologize to the victims, and so I did in my mind, pleading them to forgive me for my reckless actions. Later on, our group of 4, Villon, Caillou, Tabery, and I, proceeded to Margot's, ready to honor our deceased classmates with a few drinks. At one point, Villon stood up to share a new poem with us. Quite understandably, it was more solemn than usual, which surprised the tavern regulars, but not those of us who had witnessed what we had. When Villon announced that he was going to read a poem, the band stopped playing, and the whole pub fell silent as he started to recite. I know milk with drowning flies. I know how people dress and why. I know rainy days and sunshine. I know the tree by the apple, and its sap for that matter. I know the idleness that never changes. I know hard workers and the lazy. I know everything but myself. I know even that which I would rather not. I know the ashen and the red-cheeked. I know death, which devours everything. I know everything but myself. Even though everyone cheered and raised their goblets, the poem upset us all, especially those of us who knew what was going on in Villon's mind. The guilt and subsequent feeling of loss, the sense of losing one's safety and trust. It showed a confused spirit idly hoping for guidance in a time of grief. I caught a look of empathy on Isabeau's face. I bowed to her from afar and smiled at her before Margot blocked my view. With her hands on her hips, she said, "You are too young to be so downhearted, boys. You should celebrate your friends, not mourn them. That's what we do around here, and it's certainly what they would prefer. The first round is on me." She then gave Villon a cordial pat on the back and gestured at the band to start playing again. We listened to Margot and drank to the fullest, drowning sorrows and swimming through the sea of emotions. "Wolf is here," noted Villon when Caillou and Tabaret took themselves off upstairs with a couple of girls. I turned and saw him sitting alone in the corner of the room. I waved at him and was about to greet him, but Villon stopped me. "We thanked him already," he said, with a worried expression. "That doesn't mean we shouldn't become more acquainted," I reasoned with him. "He could become a powerful ally to us one day." "Ally," he mocked, shaking his head at my foolishness. "Just think about it, Villon," I started, with that same old persuasiveness of mine. "Our classmates died at the hands of the law, the part of our society that is supposed to look after us. Their deaths showed us what we should fight for and against." "See, that's where we differ, Montigny. What it showed me is how fragile life is and that I should therefore enjoy it while I can. You can't enjoy life if you are penniless, and once we leave the Sorbonne, we will be on our own, unprotected, and in need of direction. So far, everything is pointing to the fact that we are either going to become clerics or criminals, and we both have more experience with crime than celibacy. Wolf is an outlaw working for the law. Isn't that a brilliant combination?" "We have more choices than that, Montigny," insisted Villon, ever the optimist. "Very well, if you can come up with a more suitable plan, let me know. Until then, I will explore my own options." While we discussed our differing opinions on the matter, Wolf took the first step and approached us. "Montigny, Villon, good to have you in my lair again." I greeted Wolf with a polite bow and a smile, but Villon just nodded a greeting. "Don't worry, I'm not here to recruit you," said Wolf with an amiable smile, and added, "I just thought that you might like to join our celebration at Montfaucon tonight." "Montfaucon? Tonight?" repeated Villon, confused. "Does your gang conduct business so late?" I also wondered who would want to visit the largest and most terrifying gallows in Paris at night. Wolf laughed at Villon's comment and explained, "It's a custom. We honor and celebrate our brothers at the location of their passing. One of the Coquillards drew his last breath at Montfaucon today, so we will make him a proper farewell there. I thought we could celebrate your friends too, because even though they didn't die at the gibbet, they were killed by the same institution." The idea of dancing and drinking under the swaying corpses was delightfully morbid. I had never heard of such a tradition before, probably because I was not used to the company of gangsters. "We take girls with us too. It wouldn't be the same without them." He nodded towards his friends. About 10 men were already waiting by the door with a few of Margot's girls, including Isabeau. I was surprised by how attracted to trouble she was. It seemed that we had more in common than just our tragic childhoods. "What do you say, gentlemen? Are you interested?" I couldn't refuse the invitation, mainly because I was worried about Isabeau's safety. "It would be my pleasure to join you and your friends," I said with a respectful nod and began to polish my red boots. Villon still had his doubts, but I could tell he was as curious as I. "I suppose I could come along," he said after a moment's hesitation, "though Montfaucon sounds like an awful place for a celebration." Wolf challenged him with one raised eyebrow. "Indeed, that's why you should prepare yourself for a wild night." On our way to the gibbet of Montfaucon, we had to pass through the foulest part of the city, the Holy Innocents' Cemetery. For 300 years, thousands of deceased had found their final resting place there in the arms of their predecessors, without the luxury of having a sepulchre of their own. The roofs of the surrounding houses were clustered with bones and skulls, the oldest remains that had become decoration in order to free up space for the newcomers. That was not the main cause of the awful smell, though. The unbearable odor came from the mass graves from which rotting flesh was protruding. It would be impractical to keep burying bodies beneath the soil if they were constantly filled with more, so our senses had to become accustomed to it. As we passed the Charnel house, we found ourselves mesmerized by a mural of the Dance of the Dead. It was lit by lanterns even at night to constantly remind us of our inevitable destiny. Villon and I shared a fascination with the cheery skeletons joining the living in the exuberant street parade. The colorful images haunted us, yet we admired the portrayal of death as a celebration rather than a tragedy. Villon thought that it was meant to encourage us to embrace the afterlife as something splendid, but unlike him, I didn't like to philosophize about life after death. I had enough on my mind already. After we had passed the stinking spectacle and we could all breathe again, Isabeau distanced herself from the coquillards and fell in step with us. "I'm sorry for your friends," she said. "I will light a candle for them tonight." Villon just smiled at her and walked on, giving us space to talk. I was ready to inquire about Isabeau's availability, but was feeling nervous about it as my feelings for her had deepened. I respected her and viewed her differently to the other girls I had been with. Instead, I simply offered her my overcoat because she was shivering. She thanked me and gave me one of those endearing smiles of hers. "You seem to attract bad company," I noted, nodding towards the gang members ahead of us. "I suppose," she said, "but I trust Wolf. He takes good care of Margot and us." We exchanged a few casual thoughts about her experience with Wolf and his double life as a criminal and river bailiff until I finally gathered up the courage to say, "I was hoping that tonight—" As soon as she met my eyes, the words trailed off, yet I braced myself and continued. "Well, I thought that tonight you might join me and Estienne de Montigny II at our humble lodging." She raised her eyebrow, amused by the suggestion, and I realized how it must have sounded, so I quickly clarified. "I meant join me, of course. Estienne de Montigny II would only admire you from afar. He's used to it." I sounded like Caillou, and the worst of it was that I couldn't help it. Isabeau touched my arm, her expression comforting yet distant. "I don't think it's a good idea, Regnier." It was the first time she called me by my first name, and I realized it either meant something very good or quite the opposite. "I would like to," she added quickly, seeing the sad look in my eyes, "but I have this feeling about you." Her words trailed off and I couldn't read her expression. "A bad feeling," I guessed, already disappointed. "No, not at all," she protested. "I consider you my friend now, Regnier de Montigny, and that is more important to me than earning a few sous. I don't want to compromise the lovely connection we have." I looked at her with longing, my loins on fire and my mind in a daze. "I understand," I lied. She happily kissed me on my cheek and said, "I'm glad. I've never had a friend like you, and I can't wait to see what happens next." At first, I felt like an utter failure, but the more I thought about her suggestion, the more appealing it seemed, for it promised more than a shag on a street corner. I only hoped she didn't want to be just friends because she had her eye on Villon. Once we had passed through the gate of Saint Denis, we turned right and passed through the quiet Parisian suburbs until we reached the foot of the hill where the dreadful gallows loomed, and a real-life dance of the dead lay before us. We saw a group of men and women who had already been boisterously celebrating beneath the giant structure from which the bodies of criminals were hung. The gibbet had 3 levels and 45 windows, if you could call them that. It was these windows that offered the trembling victims their final view, the windows that nobody wished to look out of. Wolf and his company joined up with the other coquillards. Most of them were already intoxicated, and they had all begun to sing in honor of their friends who swayed along with the other corpses. Isabeau and I snuggled up closer to one another, both feeling insecure about the strange gathering. However, as I expected, one of the coquillards eventually asked her to dance. I let her go, as I always had done, because I knew she would be back. While our hosts drank, sang, and danced to the sounds of drums and flutes, I stood to the side with my chest proudly lifted in honor of the hanged men above us. Some were half decomposed, others still looked like us, and while most of their faces depicted horror and their final struggle for survival, there were also those who remained bravely serene. The terrifying sight appalled me, yet drew me in. I could not help but wonder how my body would look up there, whether I would break down during my last moments or keep my cool like a true nobleman. Some invisible power seemed to seize my throat at the thought, perhaps Lady Death herself coming to warn me. A cold shiver ran down my spine, making me shudder. I felt so alone suddenly, alone with my own mind, which felt just as filthy as my surroundings. A soft whine brought me back from my dark contemplation, and I turned to my eternally loyal 4-legged friend. I patted him, knowing that no matter how I lived or died, he would always be by my side. I jumped a little when someone's hand landed on my shoulder and turned around in fright. Upon seeing her angelic face, all gloom faded away. Isabeau gently pulled me closer to the odd company, inviting me to join the deathly dance. Just as the whirl of colors sucked me in, I caught Villon's eye in the distance. I could tell he was experiencing the same premonition, because the new world we were becoming a part of that night whispered heaven, but screamed hell.